In front of you are the US debt milestones from 1989 to 2020. The US debt has increased by more than 800% during this time, and in October 2020, the national debt exceeded $27 trillion. So how did we get here, and where is the US borrowing all this money from? It all begins at the United States Treasury. If the US Treasury wants to sell, let's say $1 trillion in bonds, then who steps in and buys these bonds? The world's biggest banks do. This is where the Federal Reserve steps in, and the Federal Reserve then buys these bonds from the bigger banks and wires them a nice payday of electronic money. Where did the Federal Reserve get all this money from? Well, they created it out of thin air by simply doing an electronic transfer to the big bank. And this is how this huge debt of $27 trillion came into existence. The Federal Reserve is just creating more and more money and taking on more and more debt. Keep in mind that not every country can do this, only countries that issue their own currency. And no other country can borrow quite like the US, whose treasury securities are in demand worldwide, largely because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, a global superpower with a powerful military. Now going back, the US Treasury has a bunch of money because they sold bonds to the big bank. What does the Treasury do with this money? They spend it. They give it out to different parts of the government, and they spend it on roads, bridges, social programs, schools, the military, and so on. And then owners and employees of construction companies, government organizations, and other companies and individuals who make money from these government expenditures then put their paychecks into their bank accounts for safekeeping. This is where the banks get involved again. Let's say a teacher deposits $50,000 of her entire salary in the bank. The banks are allowed to lend up to 90% of the total deposits. So in this case, the bank can lend 90% of the $50,000 that was deposited. That is $45,000. Let's say the bank decides to lend $45,000 to a company to buy a truck. The truck dealer who sold the truck then takes a $45,000 payment and deposits it into their bank account. The bank then lends 90% of that, or $40,500, to someone who wants a boat. The buyer of the boat then hands $40,500 to the seller, and then the boat seller's bank lends 90% of that. This goes on and on until the $50,000 that the teacher initially deposited is expended into $500,000 in bank loans. Although this is a very simple example, the reality is that 92 to 96% of all currency created is formed in this exact banking system. What does this all mean? This means that the US Treasury is taking on trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. They are doing this by borrowing dollars into creation from the Federal Reserve, which increases the currency supply and naturally causes inflation. Now, why would the Treasury want inflation? The answer is very simple. It makes the massive debt figure hurt less and easier to pay. Let me explain. 4 years ago, in our example, the Treasury borrowed $2 trillion. That $2 trillion maybe had the purchasing power to be able to purchase 100 aircrafts for our military. But 4 years later, since the magically created $2 trillion has worked its way through our banking system and has become $20 trillion in private debt, the currency supply has magnified. And because of that, the prices on everything have gone up to reflect the excess supply of currency. This increase in prices include prices on the aircrafts as well. So the government got to buy the 100 aircrafts for $2 trillion, but now, 4 years later, the $2 trillion will only buy 90 aircrafts because their prices went up with everything else. This means that the 100 aircrafts will now be worth $2.2 trillion, but the government still owes the fixed $2 trillion that they borrowed. The point to understand is that when the dollar is worth less, it makes paying off the existing debt easier. And the best part is that the government understands this. Their debt is easier to pay as the dollar's purchasing power becomes diluted through inflation. On top of that, the increased inflation helps slide income levels up, pushing individuals into higher tax brackets, which makes it easier to collect more taxes to pay for all the interest on that debt. So how does this all relate to you? It greatly does, and understanding how our money works gives you the ability to see things differently. And why not play the same game as our government is playing? I've made several videos on real estate and rental properties as an investment. Why can't we take on the same debt with investment properties and do the exact same thing that our government is doing? Because if the real estate prices skyrocket because of inflation, well, it's good for real estate investors because we will see massive appreciation and increase in rents. And we will still only owe our original debt at a lower cost. How our monetary system works is not the simplest concept to understand, but if you understand this concept, you can play the same game that our government is playing. It is so important to understand why government does the thing it does. Having that understanding will allow you the ability to look at investments through a full lens of perspective. If you can understand, you can position your own investments in a way that align with the interests of those that call the shots, while also protecting yourself if things crash and burn from this madness.